Thanks for joining ConservAmerica's monthly webinar series. Today, we're looking at the permitting process for major infrastructure projects. This can be a mundane process, but the regulatory approval and permitting process is where the rubber meets the road with respect to our nation's environmental policies. It's where our environment and conservation goals are met. These approvals are key to moving forward with infrastructure development and achieving our clean energy goals. These processes, however, can be complex, time-consuming, and involve as many as 30 statutes and a dozen regulatory agencies. As a consequence, they can be a major bottleneck in infrastructure development and often a deterrent to investment. With me today, I have 4 experts on this issue, and hopefully Alex Herrgott will be joining us. First is, in my list here is Neil Chatterjee. He's a senior advisor at Hogan Lovells, former commissioner and chairman of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and previously served as Senator Mitch McConnell's senior advisor on energy and environmental policy. Tom Vinson is a vice president for regulatory affairs at the American Clean Power Association. Tom spent more than a decade working for members of Congress in both the House and the Senate. Charlie Riedl is vice president for the Natural Gas Supply Association and executive director for the Center for Liquefied Natural Gas. Prior to joining the Natural Gas Supply Association, Charlie worked for the American Natural Gas Alliance. Alex Herrgott, who will be joining us hopefully soon, is founder of the Permitting Institute and has nearly 2 decades of experience serving at the White House, in Congress, and in the private sector. So thanks for joining us today. We would typically allow you guys to do brief introductions, but we'll quick pivot right to question and answer. And if you want to give a flavor for your practice in the case of Neil or your members and the folks that you guys represent as we get into the discussion, then just jump into it. First, I'd like to talk just about the permitting process. I think generally, and the complexities that are involved in that. We're going to get into NEPA and maybe some of the new FERC policies that relates to climate change. But I want to put this in the context of everything else that the project developers have got to go through, from planning to financing to actually getting the permit approvals, to shovels in the ground, and then turning the switches on, from soup to nuts. And this is something that Tom and Charlie, your members are very familiar with. So I wonder if you guys just to give us just this overall sense of the complexities and costs associated with developing major projects, whether it's wind and solar or transmission lines related to those, or Charlie, if it's pipelines or LNG facilities, just to put the permitting issue in context. Go ahead, Tom, if you want to jump in, or Charlie, whoever's ready.
Sure, happy to. So ACP represents utility scale wind, solar, transmission, and storage developers. And we also work on green hydrogen. Depending on the technology, your permitting process can take anywhere from 2 to 5 years to 10 years in the cases of transmission in particular, and to some extent public lands projects as well, offshore being one example, offshore wind, which we also represent. And it's the complexity, I think, is due to a handful of issues. One, there's no single permit you get, right? You've got local permits in many cases. In some places, you've got state permits, and in some places, you've got federal permits. Not just because you're on federal lands, but because you may have a species issue, or a wetlands issue, or something else that even if you're on private lands, you can end up with a federal permit. So those different layers of permitting can be a challenge, and sequencing all of that can be a challenge. But there's also a lot of due diligence that's done during the development process, where the developers are analyzing potential environmental impacts, potential cultural impacts. They're trying to cite their project in ways that the community will find acceptable, et cetera. And so it takes a long time to work through those issues as well.
Right. I appreciate that. Charlie, you offer some thoughts on this?
Very similar to what Tom sort of outlined from our standpoint. And obviously I know With having the former chairman on with us this morning as well, he'll probably offer some insights from the FERC perspective. But obviously, right now for LNG facilities, the FERC and their policy making that they've just put out, or the policy statements that they've just put out, are causing considerable concern from my members' perspective as it relates to looking at pipeline and the infrastructure needed to building LNG facilities. You can sort of look at the list of those facilities that are currently pending before FERC and how many of those have pipelines attached to them, and can sort of start to look at the challenge associated with not only getting the pipeline approved, but then also building a $15 billion facility to export gas, and then sort of add to it the complexity of what's sort of we've seen evolving at the Department of Energy in particular, as it relates to non-free trade agreement countries and the authorizations for those. And how that process has slowed down considerably in the last couple of years, and looking at what we're sort of viewing as the world events that are happening right now, that are putting a pretty fine point on the need that there's going to require additional LNG infrastructure to be built, developed, and that, again, similar to sort of what Tom's members are dealing with, doesn't happen quickly. It doesn't happen overnight. That's a 4 or 5 year kind of lead time that you need from sort of the thought of putting in pre-filing at FERC and then moving your way all the way through to operation of an LNG facility. It's not a overnight kind of process. So regulatory certainty is obviously critical from our industry's perspective.
Right. I appreciate that. I guess with the financing, it's kind of a chicken and egg type of thing, because it's easier to get the financing if you've got your approvals lined up, but you have to go through that process, and knowing you have the financing gives you the wherewithal to start it in the first place. Yeah. Alex, thanks for joining. We were kind of setting the table and trying to put the regulatory approval process, which we'll focus on, in the overall context of project development. And I think maybe you have a slide that you're going to share with folks, and then offer some comments just to kind of give folks here and the viewers just a sense of the overall scope and complexity is involved in permitting a major infrastructure project. You're muted, Alex.
It's my first day. So I think one of the issues, and it's important to keep in mind, that oftentimes folks just focus on NEPA or the 56 other permits that may be required both before and after the NEPA process. But in many of these instances, filing for an application, whether it be at FERC or a solar facility or a transmission facility, it's a very applicant-driven process. There's not really when there's 35 different executive orders, 16 different regulatory changes to long-standing precedents, whether it be on the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, the Clean Water Act, 106 consultations, and so forth. What that does right now, especially for money coming out of the IGGA, is those contractors that are putting together these applications, these 10,000 or these 1,000-page applications with about 200 pages of appendices and drawings and technical and geophysical reports, is you have to go back to the drawing board, because you don't want to have exhaustive requests for information during this is a renewable transmission project. Right here, there's 13 federal agencies, and there's 25 federal permits that you'll need, not including on average 4 to 6 state, and then whatever needs to happen at the state and local level as far as franchise agreements. Sometimes we just look at through the federal lens and we don't look at the full project life cycle. Before you even get to filing an application at this point, which many project sponsors are actually looking at, close to $600 billion worth of money for transmission, oil and gas, solar, electronic storage, CO2 pipelines. It takes them about 2 years before they get to this spot. And even when they file their notice of intent to start the environmental review process, there's an opaque process before that application is deemed complete, that is a trading paper as far as they get to a deemed completed application. And much of that is unfortunately resulted from some of the things that many of us have been involved in on one federal decision or on new accountability measures at the federal level, because you're teaching to the test. You don't want to start the clock on 2-year windows. You want to start it right at the moment that an application is sent in, but at that point it's gold plated. This process here, on average, for a transmission line takes between 3 and 5 years. Once you've completed this application or completed this process, independent of whether or not there's any legal action or stays or vacated decisions, you then have to purchase the equipment, which can take, especially with the supply chain issues we have now across all infrastructure sectors, including broadband, water, airports, you name it. It's about 2 years to acquire most of those materials, because in many instances, you don't make the large capital investment to purchase those materials until you get to a point of certainty. And then you need to build the darn thing. So overall, the overall project lifecycle on average for a transmission, solar, wind, offshore wind, you name it, is anywhere between 6 to 11 years. So the money that's originating now through IGGA or Build Back Better or through some of the grants, it's wonderful because it gets the process going, but we may not see utility scale operation for many of these projects for 10 or so years. And so I think when we talk about permitting, oftentimes it can become relatively confusing, and we blame the NEPA process, or we blame regulations, or we blame President Biden, or Trump didn't do enough, or it's the states, or it's Congress. At the end of the day, it's an applicant-driven process with 32-year-old individuals that are biologists, that are project managers with inside federal agencies that are managing $4 billion projects. The system is set up for failure, rather. And this isn't a Republican or Democrat issue. It's a process issue. And at the end of the day, we have to unravel many of these obstacles if we're going to free up, or at least induce additional investment, capital investment at risk to move through this process that is relatively obsolete.
All right, thanks, Alex. That chart was really helpful in just kind of demonstrating all that goes on and kind of getting one of these projects, from approval to where you're actually flipping the switch to make things happen. Obviously, a lot of uncertainties going on at every step of the level. You mentioned it's an applicant-driven process. There are also, it's also kind of has to wind its way through the bureaucracy after the applicant has got his completed permit applications and so forth. Filed and is got that process started. I guess in the midst of that, and one thing that is kind of a constant refrain that we deal with, here in Washington, and those that are filing for permits, is kind of regulatory uncertainties, right? So it's dealing with the processes that you mentioned in the context of a changing regulatory environment. Right, and so we're seeing it now, and we'll get to changes that are going on with respect to NEPA. We're seeing it play out in the Clean Air Act context, in the Clean Water Act context, and FERC's implementing its new natural gas policies. So I wonder if you or any of the panelists wanted to speak to kind of the effects of a changing regulatory environment on investment in major infrastructure, and the types of impediments that additional impediments and roadblocks that they throw into that process.
I can start there, Todd, and just speak, to my perspective for what I saw during my tenure at FERC. When I first got to the commission, it's very evident to me that, the process at FERC, which is not easy, it's not efficient, it's not inexpensive, was subject to considerable improvement. And when I took my seat at FERC, the commission had lost a quorum for a period of about 7 months. We had a huge backlog of project applications that had accrued, and we worked really hard to move through that backlog. And then I came to recognize, particularly when it came to LNG and applications for LNG export facilities, we're at a moment in time where contracts were available to U.S. suppliers of natural gas. And, I was genuinely concerned that the U.S. might miss this critical moment because FERC would be the bottleneck, because the process was taking so long, because it was so inefficient. And so we worked really hard to kind of streamline our process, to eliminate duplicative regulations. We entered into an MOU with PHMSA to kind of eliminate double regulations and better align our processes. We went so far as to open an office in Houston so that we could just have the personnel in place. I think the commission probably underestimated the volume of applications that would come in to FERC. And we have the same number of personnel processing, a dozen plus applications. And some of these applications run 40, 50,000 pages. And so just having the workforce in place to, and having the experts, the engineers and the economists and the lawyers to process these applications, was part of the challenge. And I was really proud of our efforts to work through that and streamline our process. And then we actually had to embark on some good old-fashioned bipartisan compromise. FERC being an independent agency, being a multi-member agency, it requires compromise. And we were at a point in 2019 where we had a number of applications before the commission. The commission was deadlocked 2-2, and there were some questions that were being put to us by some of my colleagues about what FERC should do in terms of considering the climate impacts of the projects it was evaluating. And so at the time, myself, then Commissioner Bernie McNamee and Commissioner Cheryl LaFleur worked out a bipartisan agreement in which the commission would assess the direct GHG impacts of an LNG facility that we were certificating. And look, I thought that was a reasonable compromise. It led to a breakthrough that enabled us to approve 12 projects. And as we see today, getting those projects moving at a time when our European allies, I think the world woke up 28 days ago to the reality of Russia's gas dominance over Europe. It came as a surprise, I think, to a lot of Americans. I can tell you during my time at FERC, traveling to Europe, traveling to Eastern Europe and meeting with my regulatory counterparts over there, they anticipated this. We had these conversations about Nord Stream 2. There was genuine concern raised by colleagues in Poland and the Czech Republic and Hungary about Europe's dependence on Russian gas, and they were clamoring for US LNG. This was a real opportunity. And I thought we made considerable progress towards putting the US in a position to have a positive impact, not only economically here at home in terms of job creation, not only geopolitically and giving our allies an alternative to Russian gas or Qatari gas, but also environmentally. The reality is we do it cleaner and better here in the US. And US LNG displacing dirty Russian gas would actually have a positive impact on reducing global carbon emissions. So I just thought it was a win-win-win across the board. And I think now more than ever, we're realizing the important role that the US can play in this, but we've got to have the requisite infrastructure in place. And that's why I was particularly frustrated, not just at the action that FERC recently took in introducing 2 new policy statements that completely upend the approach the commission has been taking since 1999, but the timing of it. They did it basically as Putin was amassing troops on the border to Ukraine. It just seemed really tone deaf and off-putting. I think what was particularly troubling about it is, there are 21 pending projects before the commission right now. Some of them have been sitting for, 2 years. And to apply these new conditions to pending projects seems like a wholly unjust approach. And so we'll see. The commission is set to at least, they listed on the Sunshine Act notice for the meeting on Thursday that they're going to be revisiting the policy statements in some degree. And they also listed a number of projects. And so we'll see where they go. I hope that they put the policy statements on there to perhaps get some clarifications and eliminate some of the uncertainty that this has caused. My hope is that those pending projects that are on the agenda will be approved under the 1999 approach, and perhaps the commission will undergo some more process and look to apply the new conditions going forward, but not to pending project applications. I mean, just think about it for a moment. It is expensive to commence this process with FERC for either an LNG project or a natural gas pipeline. A lot of times entities, when they submit their certificate application, they're basing it on the math working out and the economics of a project working out. Well, imagine you've been sitting for 2 years as your application is being considered, and now suddenly these new conditions that weren't present when you submitted your application are being imposed to your project. The economics may no longer work out, and that's really an unfortunate potential result from this. So I'm hoping FERC can clean it up. There was, bipartisan outrage in response to the issuance of the statements. The Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee had an oversight hearing almost immediately after the issuance of the statements, and I'm hoping that that highlighted the concerns that were raised. And to your point, Todd, is it just has a chilling effect on investment. And we're at a time right now where I think there's global recognition that we do need to invest in our energy security. We do need to invest in aiding our allies and weakening Russia's hold on Europe. But we can't do that if there's regulatory uncertainty. And so it's an unfortunate set of circumstances that have taken place. My final point on this, look, we had some cases overturned and remanded back to the commission by the DC Circuit during my tenure. But I stand by the approach we took. The reality is I fundamentally believe that any significant changes to the Natural Gas Act and to FERC's approach, for the commission to take the steps it's taking, they need explicit guidance from Congress. And in the absence of that explicit guidance from Congress, I really think this is the commission overstepping its bounds. There's one case, the Sable Trail case of the DC Circuit, that I think, there's a little, hole in that case, that they're driving a freight truck, Mack truck through, using that to justify some of this overreach. And clearly there are some issues with the courts. There are steps the commissions can take to ameliorate some of the concerns that the courts have raised. But what they did was just, they went way, way outside of their wheelhouse, as Senator Manchin termed, and I'm hoping they'll pull back on Thursday.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. I appreciate that. You kind of hit on one of the questions I was going to ask you, which was what are the bases for the authorities that FERC has asserted, particularly on the mitigation side. There's something that I'm unfamiliar with, but
it's not only that. Forget the authority. They don't even they didn't even put in the certificate how they would assess mitigation. They basically said project sponsors, come to the commission with your ideas for how you're going to mitigate the project's emissions, and then we'll decide whether that was a sufficient approach to grant your certificate or not.
Interesting. Charlie, I see you nodding your head, and these are your members that he's talking about. Why don't you jump in?
Yeah, I think that Neil did a great job summarizing it there, and I would sort of echo the comments that he made, especially about the ability to come to an agreement with Commissioners LaFleur and Magny when he was there. That was obviously instrumental for a lot of my members' projects and their expansions that they were trying to get done, at least from a permitting side. And so obviously having that ability, and I think that you could actually back into that pretty quickly under what's currently under construction. And what that actually means from a cargo basis is about 7 more cargoes a week. So when we start trying to sort of build that into understanding how much gas that actually is, it's a considerable amount. And then when we look at sort of to the point that Neil's making, the signals that are coming from, especially Europe, right? And when you think about LNG exports, Europe was never really a destination, a market for US LNG. These projects were initially proposed and built and contracted on the back of Asian gas supply. So going to Asia was always the plan for these facilities that were under construction. And to Neil's point, 28 days ago, right, we've been sending gas, we've been sending LNG to Europe since 2016 when Cheniere's first facility started. But that was always a opportunity when the prices were either upside down in Asia or we were needing a place to actually dump some LNG as a result of storage issues that these markets might have been having. And so that's obviously changed. But I think that the sort of important thing, right, is that if we look at not only the signals that are coming here domestically, which aren't sort of sending great, I wouldn't say great, but I would say they're not sort of necessarily putting a emphasis on the idea that LNG US LNG can help out of this administration. And so when we start to look at what also needs to happen is there's a European build out. So if the Europeans are serious about sort of what's happening here, the American permitting process has an opportunity to match that. And so they have an opportunity to approve their 17 projects currently before FERC, or 14 projects before FERC that are LNG related, 17 at the Department of Energy that are awaiting non-FTA authorizations. These are the kinds of signals that can match the rhetoric that the administration has been putting out in the last couple of weeks about the importance of US energy arriving into Europe. And so to the policy statement component of this, right, these are policy statements that are thinly veiled really as rulemaking. And so one of the big issues that comes with the rulemaking is if you're one of these 17 facilities that are before FERC right now, how are you even able to go ask questions of the staff, right? I mean, and Neil knows this firsthand, how important it is for these projects to be able to ask FERC staff questions as part of their filing. And the ability to interact and engage with them is critical for steering your project through any of the agencies, but most importantly, before FERC. And so now we've got these policy statements, and if you're a project that is impacted by that, which is every single one of my members, you've got this challenge associated with how are you able to even communicate your questions because you're ex parte. And at that point, you're unable to have a meaningful dialogue with the staff that's just issued a rulemaking that fundamentally changes the economics of your project. And so when you have those sort of signals and you're not getting that response from the government because of requirements legally that prevent them from having that conversation, it slows that process down. It changes the fundamentals of your investment, and it could fundamentally alter if you're able to reach a final investment decision, right? If you're a buyer looking to buy US LNG and you are one of these projects that are pending before FERC and you don't have definitive guides, or at least an expectation of how much longer it might take to navigate your way through authorization, that changes when you have Qataris sort of announcing 20% expansion of capacity, Australia announcing expansion of capacity, where these markets are guaranteed markets that can deliver gas to Europe. So as Europeans are trying to build out the necessary infrastructure to wean themselves off of Russian gas, we should be doing the same thing from a permitting perspective here to match that. There's common sense in all of this, that we have enough gas to answer that call. If we're seeing the Europeans make those kind of strong signals to build additional LNG import infrastructure.
One point, Todd, if it's all right, that I want to build on that real quick. And look, we're talking about gas infrastructure right now, but Alex and I have actually discussed this in the past. I'm looking at Tom's back screen, and he's got, abundant clean energy there. The reality is we've got to get transmission infrastructure in place to get that clean energy to market. And I was actually screaming this from the rooftops during my time at FERC, that you cannot tie up infrastructure on the natural gas side in bureaucratic red tape and overregulation and not expect that those same hurdles will exist when it comes to building out the transmission necessary to get clean energy to market. And what's ironic is that historically the opponents of pipeline infrastructure are now the proponents of building out transmission lines to get clean energy to market. And look, I'm someone who's very supportive of those efforts and the transmission reforms that FERC is undertaking. But what I worry about is that the same playbook that has been used to frustrate the build out of pipeline infrastructure and gas infrastructure is now going to be used to frustrate transmission infrastructure. You can't cabin off something on the Natural Gas Act side and not expect it to apply on the Federal Power Act side. And I think that is something that is being missed in this whole conversation. It's easy to target gas, but those restrictions will not be limited to evaluating applications.
Yeah, Neil, and I think, we're talking about all the problems, but there's tremendous opportunities as well. I think we're at this crescendo moment where the long linear needs of oil and gas are the same as transmission, right? And the same things, and I just putting this up here just for a second here, but it's not the NEPA rules or what's happening at FERC. It's also the compendium of all of the different rules that are happening in a vacuum in the different regulatory process within the individual agencies. The comprehensive effect of all these rules that are currently on the regulatory agenda attached onto new ESA, sage grouse, lesser prairie chicken rules, which increase the mitigation costs and things that aren't necessarily built out into the overhead. What many people forget is those overhead costs are passed on to the ratepayer. And at the end of the day, it is sometimes not the project developer that is incentivized to move the project quicker and faster to get to market unless they're trying to beat a preferred power agreement or a franchise agreement. But the reality here is that we have solar wind in the West in particular that is moving at lockstep pace. But unfortunately, if we're not able to fix the transmission issue that Neil talked about, then we're going to have these orphan sites that are unable to get it to market. And the issue is, last June, the Department of Energy put out in accordance, they released this report, 30 on 30 ready to go shovel ready transmission projects. Well, the 30 projects that were mentioned, Borman Hemingway, Cardinal Hickory Creek, 10 West, several others, those are still in multiple stages of litigation because the administrative record and the evolving permitting landscape has created a situation where the courts can't fix this for us. At the end of the day, Congress won't fix it because the hyperbole of the flanks, or at least opening up the Clean Air Act or opening up the Endangered Species Act, or at what point is there risk for either side to open those up on a floor in which it only takes 51 votes to peel back 20 years worth of environmental protection laws, or on the other side, additional overhead that wasn't anticipated because it was a negotiation that happened at the floor and an energy bill at the last minute. So at the end of the day, there's a misperception of what permitting actually means, and that goes so far as to the unfortunate comment made by Comms Director Saki about 2 weeks ago, when we were talking about the 6,000 permitted OCS wells, where it's like, what do you win? They already have their permits. Well, those are the construction's operation pre-geophysical step 2 of step 7 after you've been awarded a lease. There's still 8 years of permitting and geophysical studies, even just to figure out if there's enough fuel to even make the project economically viable. And at the bottom line, I'll finish up, is that at some point around the way, project developers that are putting capital at risk to build out infrastructure, because 98% of infrastructure in this country is privately funded, other than roads, bridges, and refuge and park service roads, is that we created this adversarial relationship, as several mentioned, when there's ex parte with FERC, but there's no roadmap for a regulator at the Forest Service to step out and have an iterative conversation with a project developer or their third-party contractor to do a gaps analysis that'll later lead to either litigation risk or significant deficiencies in the environmental document. And because we have this adversarial blackout relationship, we should be treating those putting capital at risk that are trying to build transmission line, broadband, water reservoir as customers rather than adversaries in a system at the end of the day we all pay for. So full stop.
And I would agree with Alex that the risk that Neil mentioned is not prospective. It exists today for wind, solar, and transmission. And there's a famous old adage that if you love wind and solar, you have to at least like transmission. And we've been talking to anyone who will listen, essentially, including the current administration, that in order to achieve the renewable energy and climate goals that they and the Democratic majority in Congress have, we can't achieve those with the permitting status quo for wind, solar, and transmission. And that goes to all of those rulemakings that Alex just showed in terms of NEPA, ESA, MBTA, et cetera. And so happy to pivot, Todd, to the solutions portion of the discussion. But I did just want to also remark on the earlier dialogue about regulatory uncertainty, just briefly. I think there's a bunch of different types of uncertainty. One is sort of the whipsawing back and forth that Neil and Charlie were referencing between whichever party is in control of a regulatory body, or Congress or the White House. And that creates its own level of uncertainty, because you may start with one set of rules and suddenly there's a new set of rules that your project is being evaluated under, both on the regulatory side and by the courts. Two, timelines create massive uncertainty. It's not just that it can take a really long time to get through the process. It's in many cases, you don't know how long it's going to take. And yes, the FAST Act has improved some of that. There's more transparency with the dashboard and things like that. But agencies miss timelines all the time. And sometimes that's on the applicant side, just to be totally fair about that. But in many cases, it's not. And if you are a project developer and you are trying to secure offtake for your power, whether it's wind or solar, or offtake for your natural gas or whatever it may be, to be able to compete for contracts, you have to know when you can get your project under construction and to the finish line. And right now, you just don't have that level of certainty with the timelines. And then the last thing I'll mention is permit conditions. I can't speak to the other technologies, but for wind in particular, and maybe to a lesser extent solar, but I think for wind in particular, we can see permit conditions where you have uncertainty not only before you've constructed the project, but in the operational phase as well. So for example, you may be asked to curtail or essentially stop generation at certain times of the year to deal with the species issue. And that also creates an extraordinary level of uncertainty in terms of the economics of your project once you're operational, which of course impacts your willingness to invest up front.
Yeah, well, and Tom, to your point, I think that One thing that we have to overlay over all of this is Neil and I and several others have been testifying in front of Congress in front of both sides. The canard of the fight of coal versus renewable energy or conventional versus renewable, that's already been decided. Renewable energy is here to stay. We're going to continue to do offshore wind projects that cost 7, 8, and then Tom knows all too well, $8, $9 billion. They're some of the largest infrastructure projects in the country. Keystone Pipeline was only $5 billion compared to what we're now doing and trying to achieve nationally. But we need 300 gigawatts of new generation over the next 5 to 10 years. We only have 200 in the pipeline. And if you look at the project delivery, you know, even just on as Tom and I have talked about this before, but even when you just look at the overall life cycle of offshore wind, even with the bite leases and what just happened and what was announced a couple of weeks ago, it takes 2-3 years just to get the lease process. Then you have to do a constructions and operations plan, which is more about the engineering and technical and orientation facility. Then you get to 3 years in NEPA. Then this is the actual construction and initial operations. You're talking at about 11-year life cycle. And so we need to have an honest conversation on both sides about not falling into the weaknesses of the canard that somehow faster means less protections for the environment. We can actually have, I know it seems somewhat cliche, we can actually have win-win if we just inject more transparency and we involve all stakeholders and move forward together rather than perception of what we have now, that where project developers have to get everything right. And those that are obstructionists, for whatever reason that may be, as laudable and justified as it might be, only has to get one thing right, and a project can soak up court docket time that could otherwise be sent somewhere else. And again, all of that overhead is 20 to 30% of total project cost on average for the 30 largest projects in the country over the last 2 years. That 30% project cost is just wasted expenditure that just escapes our GDP.
Right, thanks. I appreciate that, Alex. That's a good transition, I think, to a discussion about maybe some of the things that we can do to improve upon this process. I think, as we pointed out here, the government's policies are working at cross purposes in a lot of instances. The Biden administration has goals with respect to reducing greenhouse gases and building out renewable infrastructure, but we can't get our processes in place to actually make that happen. And for example, he did something like where he revoked the one federal decision executive order, I think, when he first came into office, and then there's all this muddying of the water with respect to the NEPA reviews, and maybe the intent is good, but it's causing confusion, I think, and it's inhibiting our ability to actually build out the type of infrastructure that we need to meet our environmental and energy goals. Alex, I'm going to shift back to you, because one of the things that you worked on was, I guess you were the first executive director of the Federal Permitting Improvement Council, and I guess you were charged with helping try to figure out and streamline some of this, and you guys did great work there, and you've got a lot of projects that you can point to that you helped usher through. But what can we do? I mean, the charts that you've put up, the discussion that we have demonstrates that this is a complex, lengthy process involving, multiple agencies, 20, maybe 30 different statutes that can all come together and affect the ability of our to get a shovel in the ground on one project. So how do you unravel this in a way that actually can bring some sense to the process?
Well, I mentioned the adversarial relationship between the project developer and the regulators, the regulated entity is oftentimes if you're a company that's experiencing issues, you may be in competition with another company, but you don't necessarily go to the public and call out the Forest Service while they're reviewing your Federal Land Management Act record decision right-of-way permit. Everyone is kind of in this sort of mentality where they're just hoping it doesn't happen to them. And at the end of the day, Congress is not going to fix the problem, because as we've already seen from IGGA, that the illusion of progress is no progress at all. Neil, Tom, and many on the call, we've worked on one federal decision. Yes, I may have pushed that through CEQ, but that was largely an outgrowth of a 2012 President Obama modernization presidential memoranda that created the Permitting Council, which I ran when I was in the administration. But one federal decision, all it says is that to the maximum extent practicable, there should be one single EIS within the federal family, and we should join records decisions if it makes sense, and that there should be all the dependency permits where agencies point fingers at each other for delays that lead to pauses that we'd at least have a lead agency that was an adult in the room that was establishing a timeline just to get to a decision, not to an approval, but to a decision. What was codified in Congress, as many people talk about one federal decision, but they forget to mention that it's only for surface transportation projects. One federal decision does not apply to anything else or any other transportation sector other than transit, rail, and road and bridges. And in many cases, those are not the greenfield projects that are being built. Most of those projects have categorical exclusions, and in many cases only have 1 or 2 permits. So you can't put one federal decision on a press release and say that we fixed the permitting problem. And likewise, the Federal Permitting Council, which you know that I love and was part of the FAST Act that Neil and I pushed over the finish line when we were working in the Senate, all of that was a voluntary process for projects of $200 million or more to have a permitting dashboard or a permitting dashboard on a website that had a permitting timeline. But at the end of the day, the agencies still drive that timetable. And the pauses that we experience, although the overall time period would say 2 years, the overall time period was 5 years because there were pauses, and they either blame the applicant, as Tom mentioned, for requests for information that they don't have on some new geophysical study or a new survey analysis on wildlife or species, or they'll blame the Forest Service because they need more time. And then the Forest Service will say, if you push us too fast, we're going to have to do a supplemental EIS because we don't have as a participating agency, don't have the relevant information from the EIS, and the federal agencies don't share information with each other. But the bottom line is, there's 650 projects over $200 million or more that are already in the first 6 months of the environmental review process in the country. And there's only 13 projects on the federal permitting dashboard, with I think only are 6 or 8 that are there. Now, Christine Herrgott, who is Biden's executive director of the Permitting Council, confession is good for the soul, is doing a much better job than I ever did on driving change within the agencies, which is difficult because you're calling a fellow political and you're saying your career staff, your folks out in the field where many of the decisions are made, are not doing their job and are missing their milestones. That's a difficult change agent and difficult job to have within federal government. Those two entities, one federal decision for surface transportation and the extension of the Federal Permitting Council, which we were able to get up to $10 million, which is about 3 times the size of the Council on Environmental Quality, is managing a project load of about $400 billion. It is not insignificant, but at the end of the day, we have to have the ability to give people putting capital at risk the confidence that there is a predictable expectation of when permit decisions will be delivered, regardless of whether they are a yes or a no, so they can either move on or address accordingly. And those 2 tools are not enough to address the universe of investment that's currently occurring. So we haven't done our job, and we need to go further. And at the end of the day, nerds are going to solve this problem because we're going to have to deconstruct and demystify that list that I showed. We're going to have to work within the regulatory environment. We have to work with tribes and locals and the courts and ensure that the kind of data that's being put into these documents is inoculated from the kind of risk that oftentimes leads to project abandonment.
Right, so you describe this is not going to have to be necessarily an incremental process, kind of untangling this web. You mentioned that the one federal decision applies to federal transportation, major federal transportation projects, but it doesn't touch on some of the other stuff that we've been talking about here today. Wind, solar transmission, or natural gas LNG facilities. I mean, is part of the answer here maybe expanding that to incorporate those types of projects?
And I'll be quiet. I get paid by the word, of course, but is that we talk about it's an applicant-driven problem or on the applicant process. Government regulators don't go outside the fence when they're looking at an application that is submitted to the Corps of Engineers, or they may ask different questions. But at the end of the day, it's a cultural and behavioral issue with the agencies. And I know we talked about the institutional and the human resource capacities, but there's 185 vacancies at BLM for GS-14 project managers. There's 120 at the Fish and Wildlife Service to do biological surveys or to delist species. We have in the regulatory budget at the Corps, we got 85 different across the nation. LinkedIn, and they're actually paying a contractor to do a recruitment exercise. No one is going to these agencies, so we're pumping all this stuff through the pipeline, but we don't have the counterparty within the federal agencies that can actually move these major projects through. So it's not just about writing a law, right? It's about trying to fix it or saying something is one federal decision and saying we've got it solved or that we need to expand eligibility. Again, I think that continues the canard that if we just add eligibilities in something and codify it within Congress, we fix the problem. We don't need to do any other work. Right now, we have NEPA coming on the forefront that is actually going to step in, have the government step in as a project developer and debate whether or not the purpose and need of the project is even legitimate. That is not a procedural change to the NEPA rule. That's a substantive change that is changes about 30 years of case law that's been supported by the Clinton, Obama, Bush, Trump, and this administration up until now. So if I was putting money behind a natural gas LNG project right now, I would not know what was going to happen with the regulatory whiplash of what's going to happen with the election a year and a half from now. Is everything that was just pulled back going to be reinstated? And then I have to jump right when I'm putting a shovel into the ground. That's the kind of certainty where we actually have to fix that. And we can do that with bringing along the Nature Conservancy, Ducks Unlimited, Centers for Biological Diversity, Sierra Club. At the end of the day, there's ways in which we can actually build these things without making it big bad oil and gas trying to rip up the environment. Because when it comes to the natural environment and the needs of human activity, it's a balance. And finding that balance is something that's going to happen within the agencies where they feel comfortable defending decisions because the applications are strong and the administrative record supports actually building these things. That's not anything that Congress can fix.
Thanks. Hey, Neil, I know you've got to jump here pretty soon. Why don't I give you one last word and before you go?
Yeah, no, I think what Alex laid out is right. And that's one of the things that has been frustrating to me about the changes to the FERC process. You know, FERC has been a beacon of stability in an otherwise volatile regulatory landscape. What do I mean by that? You look at EPA, for instance. EPA under the Obama administration went in one direction. Under the Trump administration went in an entirely different direction, and then has whipsawed back the other direction even further under the Biden administration. And when you're talking about critical investment decisions, not 1 or 2 year decisions, but 5, 10, 15, 30-year investment decisions, it is very difficult to peg those decisions to a political pendulum that's swinging back and forth. And what's frustrating is, you know, FERC being independent, being bipartisan, has been that sort of beacon of stability, as I said. And now it seems as if it is going in a similar way. And the policy statements that FERC put out on a 3-2 basis, in my view, have no value. The 99 certificate policy statement was approved 5-0. I didn't take action on the certificate policy statement during my tenure as chairman because I didn't believe that one, I felt that you need to have a full complement of 5 commissioners vote on it. And 2, I felt it had to be unanimous to have any kind of durability. And so to have it go 3-2 to where I think it'll clearly be reversed should there be new leadership at the commission in 2025, that provides no clarity or regulatory certainty. And that has a chilling effect on investment. And so I do think we need to take a step back. I do think that the global crisis in Ukraine, the absolute tragedy that's taking place there, is reorienting our thinking about how to balance decarbonization goals with energy security and maintaining reliability and affordability. And I think Alex is exactly right. Like, we need to stop viewing this as, you know, oil and gas versus renewables. I think, you know, there is a way to harmonize policy in a manner in which we can achieve our decarbonization goals while maintaining energy security and reliability. Apologies for having to jump, but thank you again for having me. This was a great discussion.
All right, thanks, Neil. I appreciate it. Tom, Charlie, I want to get you guys in on this conversation about solution. I mean, you're members of the ones, you know, building these projects and dealing with this stuff on a day in, day out basis. Your investors are frustrated, and the guys that want to put shovels in the dirt are standing around, you know, twiddling their thumbs, you know, as Rome burns, so to speak. Why don't you guys give us a sense from your perspective on what a solution or an incremental approach to some solutions might be? Charlie, if you want to jump in.
Yeah, sure. Happy to. Well, I think what Alex and Neil sort of just framed up there is spot on, right? I mean, the need for certainty is critical. And so, you know, one of the big things that we've been struggling with was the idea that we don't have predictability. There was sort of this idea that has evolved as it relates to LNG permitting over the last 7-8 years, that FERC would issue authorization, and then concurrently the Department of Energy could issue authorization for non-free trade agreements subject to final authorization FERC, and then that evolved and changed that Department of Energy decided to start waiting on issuing non-FTA authorization until after there was a final authorization at FERC. But there's no certainty as far as the timing of that. And you can look sort of no further than that there are a number of projects sitting at the Department of Energy with all of the authorizations that were done actually by Neil, and the other commissioners are there when Neil was chair, of FERC and are now sort of just sitting at DOE. There are 4 projects that are ready and waiting for non-FTA authorization. So the opportunity to codify the timing in which Department of Energy needs to act is one sort of potential solution that we would point to as a way to help solve some of the uncertainty there. Congress has obviously opportunity to potentially codify the way that could work. And then there are other areas as we think about the LNG industry maturing here in the United States. One of the big things that's sort of happening as well is that you've got these large scale facilities that were designed for, basically 24/7, 365 kind of operation, rather than scheduled maintenance for ongoing operational issues that are attached to that maintenance. Which is very different than what the regs that they're operating under were written for. So the regs that they're operating that were written for are designed for small peak shaving type facilities that only operate when they need to make enough LNG to put LNG back in the case of peak demand days. So those facilities are obviously operating under those sort of dated guidelines. And so things that we've been looking at are ways that we could streamline that and the operational aspects of these facilities and solving some of the challenges there to improve efficiencies. But these are all steps that, FERC and PHMSA, Department of Energy are all intimately aware of. Those are the kinds of solutions, though, that are, to Alex's point, is not going to sort of turn into where we're deregulating our industry in an effort to try to get around standards or environmental concerns, right? That's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to drive efficiency to match the market signals and show also, right? I mean, with the emergence of environmental justice and ESG, and when we look at that, the opportunity that LNG serves to partner with renewables, especially in these markets where they're just trying to shift off of burning dung or things like that in order to power and heat their homes, we can provide a real solution, right? And so when we're trying to provide a real solution, policy that is sort of tied to where we actually currently are, not these sort of aspirational goals, but policy that actually allows us to meet where we currently are with technology standpoints, are the kinds of solutions that we've been suggesting and putting forward to any of the agencies that are willing to sit down and have that kind of conversation with us. And I think that the final point that I would make is, look, we recognize that there's always going to be a pendulum. What we're trying to do is find solutions that keep that pendulum from sort of swinging wildly. And unfortunately, I think that what we've been seeing is that pendulum sort of swinging wildly in the last several years. And so trying to recognize that there will always be some sort of pendulum swing when you have two parties there that are trying to control this, but the opportunity to reduce some of that based upon factual data, based upon the science, are the things that we want to make sure we're pointing to. Look, are we suggesting that natural gas is the end all be all solution? No, obviously not. We think that it's a great partner for renewables like wind and solar, right? When you need the sort of base load that's a rapid response, it's by far the most environmentally friendly resource. So we're trying to educate in that manner and help reduce the amount of pendulum swings we're talking about here, or at least the violence of which those pendulums are swinging. And so I think if we can accomplish that, then I think that it would send a strong signal to those investors who are looking at putting $15 billion into an LNG facility, knowing that they'll be able to see that return over the 30-year operation of that facility.
Yeah, Todd, I'll jump in. I would agree that our view is there should be opportunities to improve permitting that both parties can support, recognizing that yes, there's always going to be some differences on the edges of those. So quickly, in terms of what ACP has been advocating for on the NEPA side, which could benefit wind, solar, transmission projects, among others. I think one, Alex mentioned the resource constraints at the agencies in terms of bodies to do the work. I think we are working on the appropriation side with Congress to try to get the various permitting authorities bodies. Two, I think timelines, as I mentioned, is important. We have advocated for a presumptive timeline of 2 years for EISs and 6 to 12 months for EAs, with some sideboards on when that could be extended and why, but having the applicants involved in that discussion, I think is important, because there may be reasons why the applicant wants a timeline extended as well, for example. I think Alex mentioned interagency coordination. We've got some specific ideas on how that can be improved and how lead agencies can actually be lead agencies and making sure that they're sort of making final decisions and moving the process along. Enhanced use of categorical exclusions, I think, is some low-hanging fruit. For example, on the wind side, even to put up a meteorological tower to test the wind speed, it generally requires an EA. And that is a temporary structure that is sitting on top of the ground. It's not even dug into the ground and has, temporary guy wires and things like that. We've been suggesting that there should be a CE for that for essentially the entire 15 years that I've been working in the trade association world for renewables, and still haven't gotten over that particular mountain. The scope of the purpose and need, I think, is important. I think, Alex, you may have mentioned this. It's an applicant-driven process, yes, on paper, but not always in practice. And so I think the purpose and need informs the alternatives analysis that is done under NEPA. And I think if you get a purpose and need that's more focused on the agency and less on the applicant, then you can end up with alternatives that are not practical for the applicant. And I think that wastes everybody's time and creates litigation risk as well. So on the alternatives, we have also argued that any alternative in a NEPA analysis needs to be technically and economically feasible so that the agencies don't spend a bunch of time analyzing alternatives that the applicant couldn't actually follow through on and would have to cancel the project even if that they were approved by the agency. Quickly on BLM, and then I'll just briefly mention ESA. On Bureau of Land Management, I think there is a rulemaking right now that Alex referenced to revisit their 2016 competitive leasing rule for wind and solar, which we are hopeful they will make significant changes in because the Obama administration finalized that rule in 2016 and the wind and solar industries opposed it even back then. And I think in practice, our concerns have been borne out in the intervening years. So one, we have a lot of concerns about their mapping processes to identify areas where they would prefer development take place. In general, the agencies aren't particularly good at mapping areas and considering conflicts and considering economics of development. So we've argued that what are called variance areas or areas outside of their preferred leasing areas shouldn't go to the back of the line for processing because those are actually the areas where developers are proactively filing applications for projects more so than the designated areas. The cost to develop on public lands is significantly higher than developing on private lands. So we've got a bunch of ideas for how to narrow those costs and have the fair market value for BLM development be more comparable to what is on private lands. And then improve transmission planning for federal lands using the Section 368 corridors designation. And then finally on the ESA side, I think a lot of our arguments there have been focused on the science. Alex referenced the sage grouse and lesser prairie chicken listing decisions as an example where they aren't really considering more recent science that is specific to wind energy and those two species. So a lot of their arguments on setbacks, for example, which drive the mitigation costs, as Alex mentioned, are driven by extrapolating science from other sources of impact to wind, and more recent science shows that the impacts are significantly less than Fish and Wildlife Service is assuming. So I think we've been arguing that they need to consider the most up-to-date science in those proceedings, and then aligning mitigation requirements with actual impacts commensurate with the actual impacts. So I'll stop there.
I just have Todd, just one comment is that, this may sound like a bleak picture, but for the first time in about 20 years for working on the original permitting pieces in Safety Lou and MAP 21 and EPACT in 05 and 07, is you don't have the American Petroleum Institute and ACP, formerly OEA, and Edison Electric Institute, ACC and NAM and Chamber all saying different things just looking out for their own members in a way in which they are perceived as rent seekers that are just going after, like Charlie's group, maybe going after PHMSA hydrostatic testing or methane rules. We're all saying the same thing. And we're saying that it's a rational approach. We need some regulation, right? If we didn't have regulation, we'd still have benzene and MTBE in our gasoline. What we're saying is that there needs to be a reasonable, multi-year predictable pathway so that it can be built in on the front end for compensatory mitigation or overhead. But we just got to get rid of the surprises. And we have a unique opportunity here where groups that traditionally have not worked together have identical definitions of success on not rolling back regulation, just having some rationality, because the projects will pay it. They just don't want the rug pulled out from under them.
Thanks, Alex. Charlie, if you got another, we're coming up on the hour here. Maybe I'll let you close it out if you've got something to offer.
No, I just would sort of add right in line with what's been said. Consistency is what we're looking for, and we can respond to the questions, comments, the science. We can provide all the data points that are needed. It's consistency that is what we're all, I think, seeking and trying to find in order to make sure that we can continue to keep operating and building our facilities. I mean, that's the key in all of this.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. It makes total sense. I don't know if we came up with any silver bullets here, if there even is one to be found. Certainly lots of complex issues to unravel. Very helpful discussion today, though, at least getting my mind around some of the challenges and opportunities that we face. It's obviously an issue that we will all be continuing to work on, and ConservAmerica looks forward to being a partner with you guys and all of that. And with that, we'll close out. I'll note that ConservAmerica has got another webinar coming up in the first week of April covering Good Samaritan legislation and abandoned mine cleanup. So if you're able to, you guys should and the viewers should join that. But again, thanks to all the panelists. Appreciate your time today. Good thoughts, good discussion, and we will talk to you soon.
Thanks a lot, Todd.
Thanks, everybody.